All right, let's jump into a deep dive that really tackles some big questions about the world we live in right now.
Definitely.
We've been looking closely at the sources you shared, especially Carl Trueman's work, his book, Strange New World.
It's quite an analysis. Truman, based on this material, gives us this really vital historical, philosophical map,
That's an app. Yeah.
to help understand how the cultural landscape, well, how it's changed so dramatically.
Right.
And the sources seem to argue it really boils down to a fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves.
Exactly. That seems to be the core of this deep dive, how our understanding, our very definition of the self, has been reshaped,
Massively before.
leading to these huge cultural shifts, particularly around things like identity and sexuality.
Yeah.
It's a huge story unfolding.
It really is. And our mission here, I think, is to try and dig into that story, explore the history, the ideas, the technological forces that have kind of forged this modern self. The sources help us unpack the consequences and hopefully give you, the listener, a clearer framework. Maybe make sense of some of the rapid change, maybe even confusion you might be seeing.
Okay, so let's start right there then. What's the central concept?
Yeah.
The sources keep mentioning expressive individualism. What does that mean exactly?
Right. So expressive individualism, as the sources describe it, it's basically the idea that real authenticity, it's found inside you, in your inner feelings.
Okay.
And you achieve that authenticity by, well, expressing those feelings outwardly, acting on them. The real you is inside and needs to come out.
And this is presented as a huge break from the past.
A massive departure, yeah. The sources really stress that historically, the self was defined much more by external things.
Your community, your job.
Your role in the community, yeah. Your family, your church, your nation, all those external obligations and connections.
Your identity was sort of given to you by your context.
Exactly. But today, the sources argue, the balance has shifted. Inner feelings have taken priority. They've gained authority even over external realities.
External reality.
Say
Yeah.
physical reality, cultural norms, social structures. The inner feeling often trumps those now.
The sources use a really striking example to illustrate this, comparing a doctor's response 150 years ago versus today.
Ah, yes. To someone saying, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body.
Right.
It's a stark comparison, isn't it? The sources suggest that back then, the body's biological reality held the authority. A doctor would likely see that statement as maybe a psychological issue.
The mind needing to align with the body.
Correct. The problem was perceived to be internal, needing correction to fit the external fact.
And today, how has that flipped, according to the analysis?
Well, the sources argue the dynamic is often reversed. Now, the inner feeling, the sense of self, holds the primary authority.
So the medical approach might be different.
It might be to see the body as the thing that needs changing, to align it with that inner feeling or identity. The feeling takes precedence over the physical form.
Wow. And the implication of that, the sources point out, is pretty significant.
Huge.
If you object to someone acting outwardly based on these inner feelings, it's not just disagreeing with an action.
No, it's often perceived as much deeper, as an attack on their very right to be who they feel they are, their authentic self.
Disapproving of the expression becomes disapproval of the person's core being.
Precisely. That's how it's often framed, according to this analysis.
Okay, so that outlines the core shift. But how did we get here? It wasn't overnight. The sources trace this through, well, a long line of intellectual history.
A very long evolution of ideas, yeah. Highlighting key thinkers, key movements that sort of chipped away at older ideas and paved the way for this modern self.
Starting way back, the sources mention figures like Descartes.
Yeah, Descartes. I think, therefore I am. You know, putting human thought right at the center, that's a big turn inward, isn't it? Defining existence by internal consciousness, not just external factors.
Okay, so that's a starting point. Then comes Rousseau.
Rousseau is presented as really crucial. He apparently located identity deep inside in our psychological life.
And he saw society
as potentially corrupting. He thought authenticity came from acting on those pure inner feelings, often against societal norms.
The sources link this to his idea of societal structures being like chains.
Yes, and they draw a controversial line from that idea, liberation from external constraints, to some modern arguments. For example, linking it, maybe unexpectedly, to pro-choice advocacy, where pregnancy is sometimes framed as preventing a woman's full potential.
So abstract ideas having very concrete, debated applications today.
Exactly. It shows the long reach of these philosophical shifts.
After Rousseau, Romanticism comes into play.
Right, the Romantics really doubled down on feelings, emotions, connecting with nature. That inner emotional world became even more validated as a source of truth in who you are.
And then you get thinkers who are even more critical of traditional structures, like Marx.
Marx, yeah. He saw economic relationships as shaping everything.
Uh,
And traditional morality, especially religious morality, he viewed it as, well, weak, an oppressive force needing to be overthrown.
and Nietzsche. He went further, questioning God itself.
Nietzsche argued belief in God was a kind of crutch, meaning wasn't something you found, it was something you created through sheer will. Morality was about freedom, self-creation, again, pulling identity away from anything external or given.
Okay, now this next step seems really pivotal in the sources analysis. Freud.
Yes, Freud is presented as a major turning point. He kind of took some romantic ideas, but went in a darker direction than Rousseau's pure inner self.
How so?
He sexualized that inner space. Freud saw the internal world not as noble, but as this cauldron of powerful, often dark, and specifically sexual desires.
And he didn't just see sex as behavior, but tied it directly to identity.
That's a key takeaway from the source material. Freud made sexual desire fundamental, not just to happiness, but to who you are.
So sex is something you are, not just something you do.
Exactly, that phrase is highlighted. And he saw traditional morality, religion, as things that unnaturally constrained these vital sexual impulses. This really elevated sex, politicized it in a new way.
Which leads, the sources say, to figures like Wilhelm Reich.
Reich picked up Freud's ball and ran with it, you could say.
Right.
He explicitly pushed for dismantling traditional sexual codes, especially the traditional family structure.
For liberation.
For sexual liberation, yes. The authentic person, in his view, was the sexual being, guided by inner drives. The sources connect this line of thought directly to modern battles over sex ed or the normalization of sexual content.
So you see this long intellectual current, inward focus, prioritizing feelings, and then sexualizing that inner life. But the sources say there's another huge piece of the puzzle.
Technology.
Right. Technology.
Technology, in this analysis, is like the booster rocket. It doesn't just enable this modern self, it makes the whole idea prioritizing inner feelings over external reality seem plausible, believable in a way it just wasn't before.
How does it do that? What's the mechanism?
Well, the sources suggest technology trains us to see the world, including our own bodies, as basically raw material, stuff we can shape with our will.
Like the doctor example again.
Exactly. 100 years ago, biological sex felt fixed, unchangeable. Now, technology offers ways to alter the body. It makes the idea of the body being like, well, Play-Doh, you can mold to fit your inner identity feel much more achievable, more real.
And it's not just our view of the body, is it? Technology has also shifted our sense of authority.
Absolutely. Traditional institutions, family, church, nation, they've had their own internal issues, sure, but technology has weakened their external grip too.
How?
Think about global connections, social media. The sources point out you might feel more connected to an online group or an international cause.
Like the George Floyd protests example. Finding traction far away, like in the UK.
Precisely. That kind of connection can feel stronger, more immediate than your connection to your local town or even your country sometimes.
And the speed of it all. Just the relentless pace.
That's what the sources call social acceleration, this constant, rapid change, technological, social, it creates instability.
Things feel less fixed.
Yeah. External identity markers like your job, where you live, your social role, they become fluid, less reliable anchors. And that instability puts enormous pressure back on the individual.
To define themselves.
To define yourself through your own will, your own choices, the sources use this image of being on confusing roads, question marks everywhere. You have to decide who you are because the external landmarks keep shifting.
Which sounds related to that idea of liquid modernity mentioned in the sources.
It's part of the same picture, yes. Liquid modernity describes this state where everything's changing, flowing, identities aren't fixed, they can be reshaped, reinvented.
And technology helps that. Mobility, online personas.
It facilitates it, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
very different from being rooted in one place, one community for your whole life.
Okay, so we have the intellectual groundwork turning us inward, and technology making it all feel plausible, even necessary. How does this modern self actually show up in the culture today? What are the manifestations the sources focus on?
Well, a major outcome discussed is what the sources call the LGBTQ plus revolution.
Okay.
They describe it as a really significant political success story of recent times, and participants are often framed in this analysis as virtuous victims.
Virtuous victims, how so?
Virtuous because they're seen as bravely living out their authentic inner selves, and victims because they're seen as having been oppressed by a society that previously wouldn't let them.
And central to this, as discussed, is separating sex from gender.
Exactly. The view that biological sex in the source makes a point of mentioning chromosomes, like XX or XY, as sort of a baseline physical fact is different from your internal gender identity.
Your feeling of being male, female, neither both.
Right, that internal feeling. And the body, again, is seen as the material you can use to express that inner identity.
So what are some of the concrete impacts? Legal, social?
The sources mention things like the Bostock Supreme Court decision in the U.S. That interpreted existing non-discrimination laws to cover sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace.
Okay.
And they discuss how this same underlying logic is playing out in really contested areas, like women's sports, access to single-sex spaces like restrooms, even things like publishing decisions.
They cite the example of Amazon removing a book on gender identity.
Yeah, Ryan T. Anderson's book, When Harry Became Sally, banned from sale while, the sources note, works by controversial historical figures remain available. It highlights the way these ideas impact practical decisions.
And this inevitably creates friction with more traditional views, especially religious ones.
A direct clash, often. The idea that your body is fundamentally yours to control and shape as you see fit, whether that relates to abortion, assisted suicide, or gender transition, runs up against traditional views that see the body and identity differently.
And secular societies increasingly siding with.
With protecting those individual rights, based on that internal sense of self, that's the trend the sources identify.
Now, there's another framework the sources bring in here, critical theory. How does that fit?
Critical theory is presented as kind of an intellectual lens that informed a lot of this. It focuses heavily on power dynamics, identifying oppressors and oppressed groups.
And the sources say the R in critical race theory is almost arbitrary.
Yeah, the underlying method of critical theory is the key thing. It's an approach that tends to see society structured by these power imbalances and systemic victimhood. It could be race, gender, class. The lens is similar.
It's pretty amazing how quickly these quite academic ideas have gone mainstream.
It is striking. The sources note you hear these concepts discussed everywhere now, even among young people.
Why do they have such appeal, according to the analysis, even with the jargon?
Well, the sources suggest the core ideas resonate with certain modern, well, pieties, you could say, beliefs about fairness. The focus on power, identifying with victim groups, this idea that resources are zero-sum. If one group has something, another must be deprived. It connects with current sensibilities about justice.
And within this, the sources seem particularly struck by the influence of gender theory.
They describe it as maybe the most, quote, implausible and bizarre application of these ideas, yet incredibly influential right now.
And they use that example of the swimmer Leah Thomas.
Right. Comparing the NBC News narrative, which likened Thomas to Jackie Robinson, breaking barriers,
With the actual crowd reaction at the NCAA championships.
which, according to the source, largely cheered for the second-place finisher, suggesting a potential gap between the dominant media or institutional narrative and maybe broader public feeling on some of these issues.
Okay, so pulling it together, what are the main consequences of this whole shift, and does anyone push back?
A huge consequence discussed is what the sources call the subjectification of truth. Truth becomes less objective, less out there, and more about what feels right or what works for you, what's therapeutic.
And this is widespread.
Very pervasive in affluent Western culture, the sources argue, even making inroads into religious communities.
What about pushback? Is there resistance?
Yes, the sources definitely acknowledge pushback exists, but they also observe that a lot of it tends to be quite narrow,
Focused on specific issues.
like protecting women's sports, for example, without necessarily challenging the deeper underlying assumptions about the modern self, about expressive individualism itself.
The J.K. Rowling example is used here.
Yeah, to illustrate how difficult it can be to hold what they call an unstable middle ground. Trying to accept some aspects of identity politics, maybe recognizing gender fluidity to a point, but drawing lines elsewhere.
It's hard to stop the logic extending further.
The sources suggest that once you accept the basic premise that identity rests solely on inner feeling and subjective expression, it becomes, quote, impossible to stop the letters coming, meaning the logical consequences will keep unfolding into new areas.
Finally, let's touch on Carl Trueman's goal in writing Strange New World, according to the sources. Why this book?
Well, the sources say his aim was accessibility, to take the deep analysis from his bigger academic work and make it understandable for a broader audience.
Like who?
Like homeschooling parents, church leaders, pastors, basically like you, the listener, anyone trying to get a handle on the cultural shifts happening around them.
So it's meant to be foundational.
Exactly. Providing the background, the why, so people can then think about practical responses based on a solid understanding. And the sources mention he's apparently working on another book specifically about critical theory next.
Interesting. And despite all this challenging analysis, do the sources offer any glimmers of hope or alternative paths?
They do mention some things, like observing the rise of a more self-conscious Christian conservative faith on some college campuses, suggesting there are places where people are actively seeking identity and truth in frameworks outside this modern, expressive individualist model.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
We have definitely covered a lot of ground, tracing this idea of the self from being defined externally to this focus on inner feelings, expressive individualism.
Yeah, looking at the philosophers who paved the way, the massive role of technology.
Right. Technology is the accelerant, making it all plausible, and then seeing how it plays out in the sexual revolution, the influence of critical theory.
And the key takeaway from all these sources seems to be that understanding this history, this trajectory, how we arrived at this point where inner feeling often seems to outweigh external reality. It's really crucial.
Essential for navigating things today.
If you want to make sense of the current cultural moment with any kind of clarity, yeah.
So given everything we've just unpacked from these sources, here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to think about. How does this rise of the modern self, this idea where truth itself can feel subjective, personal, how does that impact how you understand identity or community or even truth itself in your own life?
Yeah. What does it actually mean to be, say, well-informed or even authentic in this strange new world the sources describe?
Lots to think about.
Definitely a lot to consider. We'd encourage you to keep mulling over these ideas, maybe even check out some of the source material for yourself.